To be honest, Mortimer Freeze is one of my least favorite bosses to go against, and it's not because he's super hard or anything, but rather because his S-rank requirements are surprisingly difficult for no reason. And in this case, the main culprit is the parry requirement. Ironically enough, each phase can give you something to parry, but in practice, it's a little bit harder than you'd think. The first phase never gives you a card to parry. The second phase's parries are really inconsistent and are way too RNG dependent, which is also somewhat true for the third phase since only one attack gives you a parry and is not very easy as well. So let me be the first one to tell you that this may take a while. You could do everything else perfectly and you'll still won't S-rank Mortimer Freeze because of that dang parry requirement. But other than that, the fight itself is pretty manageable and not that difficult to learn. Before we begin though, let's go over the loadout first. For one of your weapons, I'd heavily recommend you bring Spread. It works really well throughout this entire fight and you can get tons of damage really fast. But for your other weapon, I recommend bringing one of these options. Of course, Roundabout is a great weapon for this fight and a great choice for dealing damage consistently throughout the entire fight. However, since Roundabout is a little too good at doing its job, it's going to eliminate the popsicle bats for you during the second phase, which means less parries. So you're going to have to make up for the lack of parries somehow. Another weapon I recommend trying is Charge. Charge's crazy damage per shot makes getting past the first and second phase pretty trivial. And combined with Spread, you'll be dealing insane amounts of damage. This will make getting past the last phase a lot easier since this last phase has a ton of health. And other than those combos, feel free to bring whatever second weapon you want, it's really up to you. I've seen weapons like P-Shooter work pretty decent for Mortimer Freeze, and also something like Twist Up could work as well with its EX. But like I said, I recommend bringing Spread and either Roundabout or Charge. And for your super, I recommend bringing Invincibility, because it works really well for the last phase and keeping all your requirements intact. And it also helps to deal tons of damage by doing this during the last phase. And for your charm, the ones I think are viable are Coffee, Smoke Bomb, and Heart Ring. I think by now you guys know exactly what I'd pick, but it is ultimately up to you. Well, with all that being said, let's move on to the first phase. Now, for the purpose of this guide, I do need to limit what weapons I'm talking about during this video, because your weapon definitely contributes to how you fight the boss. So for the purposes of this video, I'll be going over Spread, Charge, and Roundabout tactics. And with that, when you first enter this fight, you'll want to go with Roundabout or Charge and immediately rush damage to Mortimer. Mortimer has no hitbox during this phase, so you'll want to go inside of it and deal as much damage as you can before he starts his first attack. And chances are that his first attack is when he summons the 4 icicles that protrude from the ground and then start running around the battlefield. Once the icicles hit the floor, I recommend taking out the 2 closest to you with Spread. After that, I tend to ignore the others and try to deal even more damage to Mortimer. A few seconds after, he'll do his second attack, which he brings out a crystal ball and shoots 2 tarot cards towards the player. Or he'll bring out a big whale, and after a telegraphed cue, he'll slam that whale onto the ground, flinging any icicles that were in the way. These attacks are pretty self-explanatory. And those are all the attacks for this first phase. Mortimer Freeze will continue to do all of these attacks over and over again until we move on to the second phase. What truly makes this first phase more difficult than it seems is these icicle guys. When these icicles get summoned, they basically act as floor traps. And said floor traps can completely go out of the floor and also move. So with this phase being pretty short as is, I'd recommend really taking your time to make sure the icicles don't hit you, which is also why I'd say to take out the closest to you when they first get summoned. If you do this, everything else is pretty easy to react to, and worst case scenario, just take out the other icicles if they're in your way. If you truly take your time, you'll get past this phase consistently every single time. Well, that's all there is to the first phase, so let's move on to the second phase. When Mortimer's transitioning to his second phase, he'll move to one of the sides of the screen and ring his bell. He'll lower Jupiter the Snow Beast onto himself, and they'll basically fuse together, and they'll stay in the air for a bit before finally falling down. From here on out, he'll use one of 3 moves. For one of his moves, he'll roll back and forth across the screen and even bounce up to the other side. Luckily, he still telegraphs this for us, so it's pretty easy to react to. You'll just have to make sure to not jump when he bounces across the screen, and otherwise just jump over him and dash if needed. Another move he'll do is he'll slam the ground that causes a shockwave, and after, several spikes will pop out of the ground in the direction he's looking. These spikes will fall back into the ground, so for this attack, you'll want to make as much space for yourself as possible and then try to dash over the spikes. And lastly, he'll turn into a refrigerator and spew out both ice cubes and popsicle bats. These ice cubes will split into more and more ice cubes depending on their initial size. so the safest play is to stay as far away from the ice cubes as you can. However, a weird tip that has worked for me is to do the exact opposite of this. I figured out that if you stay near the refrigerator and only make small, crucial movements when needed, that it makes this ice cube attack pretty trivial to dodge. But it's not exactly the ice cubes that makes this hard, it's when these ice cubes are combined with other attacks that he does. Which then directly leads us to the popsicle bats. These absolute demons will constantly get in the way and come from the sides of the screen. Since the popsicle bats kinda swoop down when they're entering, it makes taking these out a lot more inconvenient than you might think. And this has led me to take a lot of stupid hits. So I'd recommend staying away from the sides of the screen if you can. Oh, and I should probably mention this now before it's too late, but you need to get at least one parry throughout every phase of this fight. But because the RNG for Mortimer is so terrible, it's honestly advised to stay in one of these phases and get as many parries as you can. And other than that, there's not much else to this phase. So to summarize, he can roll up to a max of 2 times and then bounce in the air, and for this you'll want to just jump over him or stand still if he bounces up. He can slam the ground and summon spikes, in which all you have to do is move to the side and dash over it. And he can spew out both ice cubes and popsicle bats, in which for the ice cubes, you'll want to stay close to him and go in between the openings of the bouncing ice cubes. While for the popsicle bats, you'll want to avoid the sides of the screen and directly shoot them if needed. And now it's ultimately up to you to get past this phase and move on to the last phase. This phase may seem a little difficult at first, but there are many tricks to help out for this phase. In this phase, Mortimer will appear as a big snowflake and move to either the left or right side of the screen. And you'll have to deal with 3 different attacks while managing to stand on these 5 revolving platforms. This all seems a little difficult at first, but once you learn how you can approach this fight, then it really becomes not that difficult. One big fact that some may overlook is that Mortimer himself has a hitbox, but has no hurt box. This means you can deal damage to Mortimer while inside of Mortimer, and that itself is very helpful in many ways. You have no fear of taking any damage, you can use the area to dodge attacks, and like I said, you can deal damage while inside of him. Or on top of him, that's probably the better way to say it. Which means big EX damage and big super damage. And I would recommend using invincibility and doing exactly what you see here, because it's very effective at beating this boss as fast as possible. Otherwise, you'll definitely want to use this area to dodge the mini attacks like I said, and speaking of which, let's talk about them right now. I would say his most infamous attack during this phase is the eyeball attack. The eye will periodically fire 5 vertical laser beams before disappearing into Mortimer's mouth. The eye does curve around and through the platforms, so you have to make sure you dodge this. And luckily, that's pretty easy by just dashing over or under it. And I think it's about time we mention another quirk of the fight. You see, between attacks, Mortimer will switch side to side, but he may also flip over as well. This 100% affects how you approach these attacks. But even still, the eye attack is surprisingly easy to counter. What you're really doing is waiting until after the eye shoots its first beam, then you dash over to the other side as soon as you can. And then you get some free damage for a couple of seconds. Afterwards, you could try to keep to the edge of the platform and the last laser may miss you. Otherwise, the safest play is to jump inside Mortimer's hitbox and then dash after. And yeah, that's pretty much it. In another attack, Mortimer will create buckets that split into 3 moon projectiles when they hit the edge of the screen. And they all hit different areas of the screen, with the first bucket being the highest, all the way down to the third one being the lowest. So that may help dodging this attack. But when it comes to how you want to approach this attack, it kind of depends. If you still need to get a parry, then you probably want to stay near the bottom middle side of the screen to get that parry on the bucket. But to be honest with you guys, this is when I just use my invincibility super, guarantee that parry, and then rush the boss with damage. If you're trying to make this as easy as possible for yourself, then I think it's worth the super and you're not going to be using it for much else anyways. If you don't need any parries, then the best thing you can do is stand on the highest platform and then just react to the moon projectiles. From that far away, you should have more than enough time and distance to react to the attacks. Otherwise, you can use something like Smoke Bomb or Miss Chalice Roll Dodge to be able to avoid this. However, if he's flipped upside down, that means he's attacking from the top corner of the screen. In which case, you just stick to the bottom platforms instead and then react to the moon projectiles that way. And lastly, Mortimer will create 5 snow cones that are aimed inwards that shoot out. This attack is by far the simplest out of the 3. Since we know that the snow cones always come out in a star-like shape, then we kind of know where we should be as well. From my experience, sticking to the topmost platforms is the safest play in my opinion. It'll give you the most space to dodge all the snow cones in your way for any formation possible. And I'm pretty sure that's all there is to talk about for the Mortimer Freeze fight. You should now have all the knowledge you'll need to beat Mortimer Freeze, and S-ranking him is now up to you. Thank you all for watching. We're nearly done with the boss guide playlist. If you have any ideas for guides or any other series, please leave your comment down below and I will surely read it. If you enjoyed this video or the series as a whole, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing to help out the channel. And with that, I'll see you all in the next video.